Have you ever had to play peacekeeper in your household?
I want to start from the very beginning, because if I just tell you what I did at the recital, it won't make sense unless you understand how much I had been holding on to and how long I had been waiting for this day. So picture this. I had been practicing for months, hours every evening after work, fingers sore, back aching, but still pushing because this wasn't just some random performance. It was the first real recital where I finally felt like I had earned the right to call myself a musician, in front of people who mattered, and all I wanted, literally all I wanted, was for my family to sit in the audience for 1 hour and be there to hear me play. The night before, my mom had texted that they were really drained, that the week had been brutal, and that maybe they wouldn't make it, and I remember staring at that message thinking, what week? What exactly has been so brutal? Because, honestly, I had been working too and practicing every night and still showing up, but I swallowed my irritation because I didn't want to seem needy or dramatic, so I typed back that I understood, that I'd love to see them if they could make it, and then I put the phone face down and tried to convince myself that maybe they would rally at the last second. The morning of the recital, I ate breakfast like someone forcing food past a knot in their throat, and I kept reminding myself to stay calm, that people get tired, that maybe they really just needed rest, and I kept telling myself not to read into it. But the truth is, deep down, I already felt something off, like their exhausted excuse was just a polite way of saying they didn't care enough. But I refused to let that thought take over because I knew if I let myself spiral, I would mess up my performance before it even started. When I got to the venue, some of my friends were already in the lobby, smiling, hugging me, telling me how proud they were that I was finally doing this, and for a moment I let myself feel good. Like maybe this night would be everything I needed it to be even without my family, but right before I went backstage, I made the mistake of checking my phone, just for a quick message, just to see if maybe they had texted something encouraging. And instead, the first thing on my screen was a notification from my sister's Instagram. I opened it almost without thinking, and there she was, hair perfectly done, big grin on her face, holding a shopping bag like she was posing for an ad, and right behind her in the reflection of the store window were my parents, laughing like they were having the time of their lives, and the caption said, "Best family day ever, nothing better than retail therapy with my favorites." In that moment, I swear I felt my stomach drop so hard it was like the ground had disappeared beneath me, because not only were they not too tired, not only were they skipping the recital, but they were literally out celebrating together while I was standing in the wings about to pour my soul out on stage, and I cannot describe how humiliating and isolating that felt except to say that I wanted to throw my phone against the wall, scream, cry, and cancel everything all at once. But I didn't cancel, and I didn't cry, and I didn't scream, because the stage manager came over with that rushed, polite smile people wear when they need you to move, and she said, "You're up next." And I had no choice but to walk out there with my heart cracking in my chest, pretending like I wasn't imagining my parents in some department store fitting room while strangers sat waiting for me to play. I sat down at the piano, my hands shaking slightly, and I forced myself to take a breath and begin, and even though I was playing, part of me was still replaying that photo in my head, trying to figure out why my sister thought it was a good idea to post it right then, trying to understand why my parents thought their absence wouldn't matter, and the more I thought about it, the more something sharp started to grow inside me, not just hurt, but something colder, heavier, almost like steel. By the time I reached the end of my first piece, the applause sounded far away, and all I could hear was this internal voice whispering that maybe this wasn't just a thoughtless mistake, maybe it was intentional. Maybe they wanted me to see exactly where I stood in the family ranking, and once that idea planted itself, I couldn't shake it, no matter how much I tried to focus on the music. So I kept going, piece after piece, trying to channel the anger into the notes, but each time I glanced at the edge of the stage, I felt that gnawing emptiness where my family should have been, and I realized that if they weren't here for this, for something I had worked so hard for, then they were never going to show up for me the way I kept hoping they would, and as that thought solidified, so did the plan I didn't even know I was forming. Because right then, I knew that this wasn't just about them missing my recital, this was about the years of excuses, The years of me cheering for my sister while she soaked up every ounce of attention. The years of my accomplishments being treated like hobbies while hers were celebrated like milestones, and I decided, while sitting at that piano under bright lights, that this time I was not going to swallow it quietly. And that's when I realized they hadn't been too tired at all. I kept playing because the only choice in that moment was forward, and while my hands did what months of repetition had trained them to do, my head ran in two tracks, one steady and disciplined as it counted the phrases, and the other angry and humming with the rhythm of that stupid caption and the reflection that caught my parents looking like they had never been more awake in their lives. And I realized how strange it is that you can be in front of people doing the thing you care about and still feel like you are standing alone in a hallway no one wants to walk down with you. There was a brief reset between pieces when the host said a few words to the audience, and I stepped behind the curtain long enough to take a breath that did nothing, opened my phone again, because I am apparently a glutton for evidence, and saw that my sister had added more to her story, a little video of her turning in a mirror while our mother held up a dress like a trophy and our father joked in the background about losing count of the bags, and the caption read something about how they had earned a family day after a hard week, which punched me with the absurdity of the words because, honestly, who writes that while skipping their daughter's recital after claiming they are too exhausted to sit down for an hour and clap? I sent one message that was polite but not friendly, something like wishing them a nice day and letting them know I was about to start my second set, and my mother responded with a short line about being proud of me and how they would watch the videos later, which would have been fine if it had not arrived alongside a boomerang of my sister clinking smoothies with her, and my father left the message on read, which somehow hurt more than if he had typed something dismissive, because the silence said, "We saw you and we still chose this." Standing there with the taste of that reply in my mouth, I saw the whole pattern like a map I had been refusing to unfold, because this was not new, this was just louder, and it reminded me of all the smaller moments that had stacked into a wall. The missed school concerts that were brushed off with jokes about long days, the way my sister's minor achievements got balloons and posts and inside jokes, while my milestones were met with a pat on the shoulder and a promise to celebrate later that always dissolved into nothing, and I felt this heat that was not crying and not panic, but something sharper, a refusal to be quiet this time. I went back out and played the next piece cleaner than I expected given the circumstances, and while the music did what it always does, which is give my brain a path to follow when everything else is loud and messy, I was also planning, not a meltdown. Not a public fight, not the kind of spectacle that gets dismissed as drama, but something simple and exact that would land where it needed to, because there was a microphone on the piano for short introductions, and I had skipped using it earlier to keep things streamlined, yet now I understood that one measured sentence could do more for my sanity than 1,000 private arguments where I would be told I was overreacting. Between movements I tested the words in my head like I was checking the feel of a key before turning it, and I kept rejecting anything that sounded bitter or theatrical, because I did not want to hand them an excuse to call me emotional. I wanted the sentence to be calm and clean and undeniable, something that would sound fine to strangers, but would hit home for the people who had chosen a checkout line over a chair in a small hall where their daughter was finally doing the thing she had always said she would do, and the sentence came together without effort, like it had been waiting for years for the moment I would finally let it out. I knew there would be fallout, because there is always fallout when you stop making yourself small, and I imagined how my sister would spin it later, how she would say it was just shopping and that I blindsided her, and how my parents would try to smooth everything with that soft tone that asks you to be understanding without ever owning what they did. Yet, even as I pictured the aftermath, I felt a steadiness I have not felt in a long time. The steadiness that comes when the scale that has leaned against you for years finally shifts one notch in your favor, and you realize you can stand upright without asking permission. Friends in the front rows had their phones out, not because I had asked them to, but because that is what people do now, and while a part of me worried about the clip traveling farther than intended, another part of me recognized that the truth has a way of finding an audience when you are precise and fair, and the truth here was painfully simple, that I had been told they were too exhausted to sit down. And minutes later the world was shown how energized they were by sales and mirrors and fake Indoor lighting that flatters nothing but denial. When the host nodded for the final piece, I pressed my palms together to ground myself, looked at the microphone like it was any other tool, not a weapon but a switch, and I rehearsed the cadence one last time so that I could deliver it without shaking or rushing. Because this was not about revenge that burned everything down. This was about staking a claim in my own life with a sentence that was both a thank you to the people who showed up and a boundary for the people who did not, and by the time my fingers hovered over the opening chord, I knew exactly what I was going to do when I reached the end. When the host stepped aside and the hall settled into that focused quiet that always feels like a held breath before something fragile, I set my hands where they needed to be and let the opening measures carry me. Because if I thought about my family, I would miss a note, and if I missed a note, I would start doubting the whole night. So I made a deal with myself to finish the piece clean and steady, and then say exactly what needed to be said in a voice that sounded like mine on my best day. Not shaky or bitter or pleading, just clear enough that there would be no way to misunderstand where I stood and what this hour meant to me. The piece itself became a container for everything I was refusing to say, because every time my mind tried to go back to that caption or the reflection in the glass, I tightened my focus on the phrasing, the balance between left and right, the breath before a transition. And as the music did what the music does when you give it your full attention, I could feel the anger settling into something sharper and more useful, not the kind of rage that makes you lash out and then apologize later, but the kind that turns into a single line that lands exactly where it should, and by the time I reached the last page I knew I had kept my end of the deal and earned the right to take the mic without apologizing for how it would make them feel. When the applause began, I let it run its natural course while I counted to a slow 5 in my head and rested my hands on my knees so it would be obvious that I was not rushing out. And then I reached for the mic with the same calm I use when I pick up my bag after a lesson, and I said thank you to the audience in a way that honored them for showing up and sitting with me through nerves and effort and all the messy parts of being human. And only then did I let the sentence come out steady and even and as simple as I had promised myself it would be. For those who could not spare an hour, this one is mine. There was a ripple you can feel even with your back turned. The small collective intake that means people understand more than you explicitly gave them. And I watched a few faces shift from polite appreciation to that look people have when they realize they are being allowed into the truth of a night, and I did not embellish or explain or add a second line, because the point was not to perform a speech. The point was to set a boundary in public where it could not be talked over later, and then I stood, bowed once, and walked off stage with a steadiness I had not expected to find. Backstage, before anyone could pull me into congratulations that would wash over me like noise, I saw my phone lighting up with messages and reactions and a screen record someone had already posted from the front row, and I watched my own mouth form the sentence on a stranger's story and felt that odd mix of relief and dread, because with every share the chance of a family explosion grew, and still, I did not regret it, not for a second, since the alternative would have been to swallow it again and carry the same quiet resentment back home and pretend I was fine, and I am done pretending I am fine when people who should care treat me like a side project. Within minutes, a mutual friend pinged me that my sister had seen the clip and that she was furious in the way people get when they are afraid of looking bad, which told me everything about the guilt she would rather not touch. And while part of me braced for the incoming spin, another part of me felt a kind of grim satisfaction that the message had reached its intended audience without me sending a single text, because sometimes the most honest thing you can do is say what is true once and then stop talking. I stayed near the door to the hall while the next performer set up, knowing I would have to shake hands and accept compliments and pretend that my night was not turning into a family referendum. And then I heard the unmistakable storm of fast footsteps and a voice that I know too well calling my name with that choked edge that means tears are not far behind, and when I turned I saw my sister pushing through the lobby with our parents trailing behind her, faces tight and eyes scanning for damage. And I realized the mall had been close enough for them to arrive almost immediately, which would have been funny if it were not so on the nose, and as she reached me with her phone still in her hand and her anger boiling over, I understood I had set something in motion that could not be put back in the box, and I stepped outside first so that whatever happened next would not become part of the program for the person who had to follow me. I stepped through the side door because the air in the lobby was already buzzing with that particular kind of curiosity that turns any raised voice into a spectacle, and I did not want to hand my sister an audience she could manipulate into sympathy before I had even said a word. So I moved outside to the small concrete landing by the loading area where the staff took smoke breaks and where the noise from the street forced people to speak plainly, and when she caught up to me with our parents a few steps behind, she launched straight into the accusation that I had humiliated her, that I had humiliated them, that I had made a private family choice look cruel. And the way she emphasized private told me everything about the version of the story she wanted to survive the night. I let her talk because you learn more from a person when you let the thread spool out without tugging, and I watched her try to turn outrage into righteousness, as she said it was just an hour, that she had needed a reset, that our mother had promised her a day together because she had had a rough week, and that my choice to say that one sentence was petty, vindictive, and unnecessary, and while she lined up the words like little shields to hide behind, I asked the only question that mattered, soft and direct and impossible to dodge, which was whether she had told them not to come because she wanted the day to be about her, and the way her eyes flashed before her mouth formed the denial told me I had put my finger exactly where it hurt. Our father tried to step between us with that calming tone that is meant to move the conversation into a softer lane, saying that this was not the place and that feelings were running high. And our mother added a practiced line about loving both of her daughters equally and being proud in different ways, which might have worked on another night, but I was not willing to do the polite shuffle anymore. So I kept my voice level and asked our mother to repeat what she had texted me earlier about being exhausted, then asked my sister to confirm the timeline on her posts, and finally asked our father whether he had read my message about beginning the second set and chosen not to respond, because sometimes you do not need to raise your volume to raise the stakes. You only need to put the facts in a straight line and make people look at them without flinching. My sister scoffed in that way she does when she is cornered, saying the recital would have other dates and that I was not a child who needed a cheering section to function, then pivoted to the complaint I have heard all my life. That everything with me turns into a production, that my music always demands center stage while she has to fight for scraps of attention, which would have been funny if it were not so familiar, and when she tossed in that our mother had told her it was fine to skip. Because I was independent and fine without them, something in me went very still, because that single line was the exact sentence I wanted to exist in the open air where it could be owned or denied without wiggle room. I pulled my phone from my pocket without theatrics, opened the voice memo app like I was checking the time, and kept it low enough not to invite drama, yet high enough to capture the words. Then repeated her claim back to her in that careful way therapists use to confirm understanding, asking if she was saying that our mother had told her it was fine to skip because I did not need support, and, before our mother could throw a blanket over the flames, my sister, in her determination to be right, said yes. That was the idea, that I was self-sufficient and would not crumble, which was meant as a compliment in her mind, but sounded like the most convenient excuse in the world. And I glanced at our mother and watched her swallow a protest she could not articulate without contradicting the truth we had both just heard. People exiting the hall began to trickle past with murmured congratulations, and I smiled and thanked them while keeping my focus on the conversation, because there is a quiet power in refusing to hide when someone expects you to shrink. And the more my sister swung from anger to justification to wounded self-pity, the clearer the pattern became, not just tonight's calculus about shopping and selfies, but the months and years in which my needs were treated as optional and her wants were treated as urgent, and I realized there was no argument I could make in that moment that would land harder than their own words landing in their own ears. So I asked one last question, slow and careful like a key turning, whether my sister believed my recital mattered less than her day of buying things, and whether my parents, seeing her posts while I was playing, believed their place that evening was in a department store rather than in a chair with a program in their hands, and my sister, too committed to her line to recognize the trap, answered that it was not about mattering less. It was about priorities and timing and mental health, which She insisted she was protecting, and our father said something about complicated weeks and doing their best, and our mother tried to say it had all been a misunderstanding, and in those overlapping replies I heard everything I needed for the next step. I stopped recording, labeled the file with the date and the venue name because details prevent revisionist history, and then, with a calm that surprised even me, sent the audio to our family group chat with a short note thanking everyone who had asked how the recital went and adding that the clip might answer their questions better than I could. And while the message delivered and the little profile circles clustered under it, I looked up at my sister, who finally understood what I had done, and at my parents, whose faces showed the exact amount of panic that appears when the story you plan to tell later can no longer stand on its shaky legs, and I told them, as gently as I could manage, that I would be at the reception if they wanted to sit down and listen, because I was done speaking into a void. Inside the reception room, the buzz of small talk mixed with the stream of pings lighting up my phone, and as plates clinked and people told me they had loved this passage or that transition, I watched the family thread become a live referendum on what had just happened. Because my aunt from out of state wrote that she had believed my mother when she said I did not want a fuss, my uncle sent a string of kind words about pride and showing up, and my grandmother, who has never figured out filters, and therefore has nothing to hide behind, asked point-blank why the girl with all the shopping bags had not been in a chair, and then, as the audio finished playing on each device, the tone shifted from placating to sober. And the compliments that followed in person felt less like noise and more like a covering fire that allowed me to sit down, pour water into a paper cup with hands that had finally stopped shaking, and decide, with more clarity than I have ever had in my life, that this was the moment I would set the rules going forward. My sister arrived at the doorway with wet lashes and a set jaw and announced that I had blindsided her, that I had taken a private moment and shoveled it into the mouths of people who love drama. And I listened without interrupting because it is hard to hold both compassion and boundaries in the same palm, yet that is what I wanted to do. So when she took a breath, I told her that I was not publishing a takedown and that I was not interested in a public feud, that what I wanted was what any adult with a spine and a dream wants, which is to be treated with the minimum level of respect it takes to sit through 1 hour without pretending to be dying of fatigue. And, while she rolled her eyes at the word minimum, I told her in the same steady tone that I would not delete the clip from the family thread because I would not vacuum away my own reality anymore. Our mother tried to step in with the gentle logic that has smoothed over 1,000 awkward dinners, offering to host everyone on the weekend and talk it out when no one was feeling raw, which sounded lovely in a vacuum and laughable in the context of that caption. And I said I would be willing to sit down if the first 10 minutes contained a specific apology that did not include the words misunderstanding or exhaustion, and that did not pivot into my sister's feelings of being overshadowed. And when my father opened his mouth to say the line I could see forming about complicated families, I held up a hand and said I had something else to add, a simple change I was making from this night forward that would make arguments like this unnecessary. And, because I have learned that people absorb boundaries better when they are practical, I delivered it like an update instead of an ultimatum. I told them that the 2 complimentary seats I normally kept aside for family for every future performance would be reassigned to the 2 people who had shown up for me with consistency and without conditions. That my first choice was my first teacher who never accepted payment when I could not afford it, and my second choice was the neighbor who drove me to lessons when my car died and never turned the ride into a favor I had to repay with silence later. And I said that anyone else was welcome to come, to buy a ticket like everyone else, to sit, to clap, and to claim a photo afterward if they felt moved, but that the days of saving spots for people who did not treat my time like it belonged to me were over, and as I said it, the knot I have carried since high school loosened in a way I did not expect, as if naming what I would no longer subsidize had returned something to me that I did not realize I could reclaim without asking. My sister said that this was petty and performative and that I was punishing her, and I told her that if she wanted to know what punishment felt like, she could look at the hours I have spent pretending I was not hurt, so she would not have to consider that her wants were not the only wants in the room. And when she demanded that I at least take down the audience clip from the front row, I said I could not control what other adults share when they witness a moment, that the only thing I could control was my own behavior, and that my behavior from now on would be governed by one rule, that I would not lie for comfort. Not about logistics, not about feelings, not about whether I needed people to show up. And that if that made me the bad guy in a story she told to her followers, I would live with it, because I had finally learned that living with myself was the only non-negotiable I had. By the time the cake came out and the plastic forks were passed, my phone had filled with messages from relatives I barely hear from. Not to stir the pot, but to say that they would have come if they had known, and that the video of the closing line made them want to stand up in their living rooms. And while I will not pretend that validation from people who do not buy tickets fixes a lifetime of minimization, I will say it steadied me enough to do the last thing on my list, which was to post the clean recording of my performance with a simple caption that thanked everyone who had taken an hour to sit with me, and that repeated, without heat, the boundary that had changed the night, that those who could not spare an hour could not claim the photo, the credit, or the narrative. And then I put the phone in my bag and returned to my friends, because the part of the evening that mattered was still happening in a room where people had shown up with their whole selves. In the days that followed, my parents asked to meet, and we did, and they apologized without euphemisms and said they had thought resilience meant I did not need them in the same way. And while I told them I appreciated the apology, I also told them that their understanding would be measured the next time I performed, and not by promises spoken over coffee. And my sister sent a long message that began defensive and softened into something like remorse, and I responded with one sentence, not cruel and not open-ended, that I hoped she would show up next time, and that if she did we could start from there, because the truth is, I do not want a family I can beat in an argument. I want a family that knows what a chair in a small hall means when someone you love is finally claiming her hour, and until that is true, I will keep the 2 front row seats for the people who have already proved they understand. Which is why when the next date was announced, I messaged my first teacher and my neighbor with the simplest invitation I have ever sent, that the seats were waiting and that this one, like the last one and the next one after that, was mine.